Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-host today, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the National Emergency Management Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation, thank you for joining us. Today, we're presenting the second in a two-part webinar series discussing how government roles, responsibilities, and authorities have evolved in recent years and what Homeland Security professionals might anticipate next with a new presidential administration, a new Congress, and a Supreme Court majority that has changed in recent years as well. In this series, we're looking back at the major events of 2020 and exploring what these events and others like them could mean for local, state, and federal government moving forward. We kicked off this series 2 weeks ago, looking back at the major public policy and legal issues that emerged during the response to COVID-19. And in today's discussion, our panel will consider similar questions and challenges that came to the fore during the security events in the past year, ranging from protests and incidents of civil unrest to the events at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of this year. And now it's my pleasure to welcome back our panel, and in particular, our moderator for this webinar series. Eileen Decker is an alumna of CHDS and now serves as part of our legal and communications subject matter expert team. Eileen is currently the president of the Los Angeles Police Commission, and she is also a law professor at USC and UCLA. Previously, Eileen served as the Los Angeles Deputy Mayor of Homeland Security and Public Safety, and also as a U.S. Attorney in Los Angeles. Eileen, thank you for again bringing your legal and public policy expertise to our discussions and for moderating today's panel. Now I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dawn, and thank you so much for having us back. We do appreciate it. Welcome to everyone who is joining us today. As Dawn said, this is the second in a two-part webinar series about the frameworks used for governing. Today's webinar is called Blurred Lines, Civil Protest, Uncivil Unrest, and Government Response. And in this session, we hope to cover a variety of topics related to how state, federal, and local authorities responded to the protests of 2020 and 2021. And more importantly, what we might expect in the future when dealing with peaceful protests to violent actions taken in the name of protest. Our goals today include focusing on the legal and policy trends of the last year and what they mean for Homeland Security professionals in the future. Have the roles of the federal, state, and local officials changed as a result, if at all? What does it mean for working with the public in such a polarized world? How do we regain the public's trust after all of these events, if that is even possible? And what can we expect from the new administration, a Congress that is almost evenly divided, and the courts, particularly one where the Supreme Court now has a more conservative majority? Importantly, how does all of this impact state and local decision makers? Now, while we plan to discuss broad legal and policy frameworks that inform decisions that are made within specific jurisdictions, we do not plan to speak about tactical decisions made, such as the boots on the ground decisions, or a specific decision or a law related to individual jurisdictions. Instead, we intend to take a broad view as to the principles that apply throughout the country, the frameworks, if you will, in how these decisions are made. Now, even that is a lot of ground to cover in one session. Luckily, we have two distinguished legal scholars to navigate us through all of these complex issues. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you today John Yoo and Dan Farber, who both are members of the law faculty at the University of California at Berkeley. First, let me introduce to you John Yoo. He is the Emanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and the author of Crisis and Command, A History of Executive Power from George Washington to George W. Bush. He's also the author of Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power. He is joined today by his colleague, who I'm also very pleased to introduce, Dan Farber, the Show Sato Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the co-author of Disaster Law and Policy and the author of Contested Ground, How to Understand the Limits of Presidential Power. Dan and John, thank you for being with us today in this conversation. We may not have all the answers today, but I know our participants and attendees will walk away with a better understanding of the frameworks within which decisions are made. So let's get to it, shall we? But we should begin with a baseline for our conversation today, which largely will deal with federalism. It's a word and a term used so frequently. But John, could you begin our conversation today with an overview of principles of federalism?
Great. Eileen, it's great to be back with you and great to be back with Dan and to meet and speak before all of you about this really important and difficult question we have before us. Basically, I think federalism is the most important principle hardwired into our constitutional and political system. We're not a country like, say, Great Britain or, say, Japan, where everyone who works for the government works for one single national government. Instead, federalism means that we have two levels of government, the national government and the state government, and they are both sovereign. They both have overlapping jurisdictions, but in terms of what the Constitution did, it distributed those powers in an enumerated, limited way to the federal government, leaving everything else to the states. And of course, for purposes of our discussion today, the most important power that's left to the states is what we call the police power, the power to maintain public health and safety for all citizens. The federal government doesn't have a general police power to ensure order throughout the country, to prosecute, investigate crimes. That is primarily the job of the states. And then the states can devolve that power to counties and cities. And I just close by saying, and the bulk of resources, the personnel, the funding, the infrastructure of criminal law enforcement, of protecting public health and safety also rests with the states, with the federal government, having narrow enumerated powers, very powerful ones, particularly in the areas of spending and taxing, purchasing, research, intelligence, sharing information, but primarily the ground level decisions about maintaining public health and safety are going to rest in our constitutional order with the states.
Thank you, John. Dan, would you add your perspective to all of this?
Well, I agree with what John has said. I think it's really important to keep in mind that the federal government primarily offers backup and support for local activities. There are some occasions when the feds can step in, and the feds have some oversight in terms of civil rights. But basically, maintaining order in cities is first and foremost the job of the state government, and then by delegation, the local government.
Well, let's dive into this a little deeper, and specifically as related to some of the security events we've seen in the last year. And my first question is, let's start at the federal level. Is there such thing as a national level event when it comes to policing and security? Recent events at the Capitol, or even last summer, where so many cities, not just an individual city, were facing significant protests. What rises to a national level event, if any? Dan, why don't you take that on?
Well, I think clearly anything that happens in the District of Columbia is national, in the sense that that's really the domain of the federal government. Federal government also has a direct concern with protection of federal property, federal personnel. Just the fact that there are problems in many different parts of the country doesn't necessarily mean it's a federal problem. To some extent, that's just a sort of multiplication of local problems, although that may trigger the federal government's responsibility to provide support on a greater scale. And of course, to the extent that there are actually connections between events in different jurisdictions due to coordination between some of the people involved in those events, that would become a federal problem. But again, the fact that the same thing is happening in a lot of different places doesn't by itself make something a problem for the federal government to deal with.
So not spontaneous events, but John, can you add your perspective of what rises to the level of a national event, if anything, in the context of protests and policing issues?
Yeah, I think Dan did a good job explaining the location, DC, federal property. I might just add on to it, also the entities involved can be matters of national concern. For example, on the 9/11 attacks, when I was working at the Justice Department, the fact that the entity that carried out the attacks was from abroad made it a matter of national security and of primary interest to Washington, DC. You could also say, Dan briefly mentioned this, groups, if there are groups that are operating across state borders or even international borders, and then are participating in events simultaneously in these different places, that would be could be a matter of national concern. And then the last thing I would also include would be if any of these attacks are also, or disruptions or riots have the effect or the intent to interfere with the movement of interstate commerce, with our interstate networks, communications, the internet, and so on. I think either trying to disrupt those networks or even using those networks to try to plan and coordinate, carry out violence would make it a matter of interest, not just to state. I mean, we're not talking about excluding the states. This is just more in the federal government overlapping with the states. I think those would also be matters of national concern as well.
Very well. Let's look at the different branches of government and their respective roles, if you will. And John, why don't you go first this time? And looking at the chief executive, the president of the United States, what can we expect from the Biden administration? Both should there be additional protests this year, but also with respect to police reform, if we can pivot a little bit in addition to civil unrest, but also police reform, what might we expect from the executive branch of government this year?
I'm not sure about the policy of the administration. I think I have a pretty good idea about the legal authorities. But the Biden administration hasn't really made clear how much support they're going to throw in this sort of coordinated response to any unrest that might arise after, say, the Chauvin trial ends, or if there's a resurgence of protests that might become violent this summer during continuing COVID lockdowns. You could say that the administration has made clear it intends to make the investigation and prosecution of the attack on the Capitol in January a high priority. You observed that Attorney General Garland said that would be the main focus of his time in office, and you can see that that investigation is going forward with great energy, I think. In terms of what the administration could do in terms of support, so I think there's a lot of things the Biden administration could choose to do if it wants to. It could go so far as using the Stafford Act to say there are disasters in some of these cities that are caused by the rioting, which would allow there to be financial resources and supplies sent. You could even see the possibility of deploying troops if there is such sufficient disorder, as we saw, for example, here in California with the Rodney King riots back in the early 90s. If disorder becomes so great that it overwhelms local law enforcement. But most importantly, and hopefully that doesn't happen, but most importantly then, to prevent that from happening, I think what the Biden administration can do now, and I expect they are doing, is they could ramp up collection of information, sharing information, getting helping local and state police authorities ready now before anything happens, by trying to use information sharing between federal government and state governments, and then trying to supply local frontline police departments with equipment, hopefully with that kind of intelligence support, operational support to be ready.
Dan, your perspective on the new administration, what we might expect in the next year?
I, like John, think that the administration will have some powers that I expect they will use to be supportive of local responses. They, I think, are aware that widespread public disorder is undesirable, both for society and even in more narrow political terms. They, at the same time, I think, are going to be sensitive to issues about overreaction. We've already seen a renewed interest in possible civil rights violations by local police. So I think they're going to be walking a little bit of a delicate line, but I don't think that's going to interfere with their desire to ensure that disorder doesn't get out of hand.
John, I want to ask you a follow-up question to your comment about intelligence sharing, because before today's seminar, we did get a question from a member of the audience expressing concern about not having enough intelligence and the intelligence sharing, particularly when it comes to protests, seems to not be as robust as they would like. Do you have any perspective to share, particularly since you did work in government following 9/11, the challenges associated with developing that stream of intelligence and getting out? It might be helpful to understand why it may seem at this moment it's not as robust as it could be.
It's a great question, Eileen. Going back to when I was in government, one of the things we discovered after the 9/11 attacks, that rather than sharing information, the FBI and the Justice Department actually didn't want to share information because of one, information being classified, having national security sources from abroad, but second, because I think they were worried about the civil liberties issues that Dan just mentioned, that there had been this concern after the effort to respond to the Vietnam War protests and then Watergate, that the intelligence agencies had gone too far with their use of information. And so there were actually quite strict controls placed before 9/11. After 9/11, of course, what we tried to do was to encourage as much information sharing with regard to terrorism, for international terrorism, as possible. And so this led to the creation, for example, of these fusion centers, which maybe some of the people calling in today participate in or have seen. And the idea behind this, and I would think these fusion centers could be very valuable in what we're talking about now. You know, these fusion centers exist for federal and state personnel to be together, to share information, and then to use it to respond to or hopefully prepare for threats as they approach. One last thing about the law and policy of this is that the Supreme Court has been very careful to say that federal and state officials keep very clear who's enforcing what laws, that state officials enforce state laws, federal officials enforce federal laws. But the one area where the court has always said full cooperation is allowed, that you don't have to worry about these sort of stovepipes, is when it comes to sharing information. That the court has said is to be encouraged, and the Constitution does not really limit it in the way it does, which official actually applies the law against a private citizen.
Dan, let me throw it back to you to see if you have anything you want to add with respect to the intelligence sharing concern expressed.
I think that's a very real concern. I think one of the things that we've learned both from 9/11 even and going forward to some of the recent disorders is that even within a single organization, a single police department, there can be a failure to share information or for information to get to decision makers in a timely manner. And I think that's something that individual police departments also, especially, of course, larger ones, also need to be aware of. A lot of the information, to the extent that we're talking about spontaneous outbreaks in cities, a lot of the information is going to be local. And the federal government is not going to know what people in a particular city are getting upset about, or how close they are to taking to the streets, or who might be leading that effort. And that is something I think that has to be developed locally, and that's critical because police departments, mayors, governors are going to be facing very difficult on the ground decisions. And you really don't have much of a chance of getting the right answer if you don't have the information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd like to shift a little bit. We've been talking about the executive branch. We can't leave out the others. I want to talk a little bit about Congress's role here and get your thoughts first on what their role are. What pieces of legislation, if any, do you see perhaps forthcoming? And I'm going to throw a third aspect to that question about domestic terrorism legislation. There's a lot of debate, a lot of controversy, a lot of questioning about whether it is needed. What are the pros and cons? So if you could address those broad questions, Dan, what laws do you envision specifically coming from Congress, and also with respect to domestic terrorism legislation?
Well, of course, in general, getting anything out of Congress has been a very difficult task over the last decade or more. There's a lot of gridlock, and it remains to be seen whether you can get enough of a consensus to pass anything. If it's a spending bill, you can pass the law with a bare majority in the Senate, but otherwise you have to get up to 60 votes. That makes things a lot harder. So I think something on the spending side over the next year is probably the most likely, either perhaps in additional support for certain activities by police departments. I can imagine that this Congress might want to shift some from supplying sort of military grade technology to other kinds of training or resources that would sponsor a different approach by police departments. So we could see something like that. I think there will be some interest, at least among Democrats, in strengthening sort of civil rights type enforcement against police departments, but whether that could get through both houses to the president, I really just don't know one way or the other. In terms of domestic terrorism legislation, at least at this point, I haven't really seen a clear argument for why that's needed. The federal government has a broad set of criminal laws that already allow it to go after various kinds of interstate conspiracies, criminal organizations, crossing state lines, or using electronic media for criminal purposes. At this point, it would seem to me that those laws are probably sufficient, at least on the criminal enforcement side. And I'm not sure that, as I say, that the case has been made for why we need specific anti-terrorism laws. But John has more experience than I do with anti-terrorism, at least in the more international setting. So he might have a different perspective.
Well, John, that's a perfect segue to you. What do you think?
I was going to amend Dan's point, but then he corrected himself. It is hard to get things out of Congress today, except it seems money. Just passed a $1.2 trillion spending bill, and there's another one coming. And it seems to me some of that money could be used by states to reallocate towards the kind of resources we would need to respond to civil unrest. The second thing is I fully agree with Dan that doesn't seem to me new law is necessary at the criminal level, at the federal level in the criminal area to handle domestic terrorism. It seems to me that you have the standard combination of conspiracy plus attacks on the federal government, attacks on federal property, or attacks on the instrumentalities and channels of interstate commerce like airports and railroad stations, or the internet and the mails. And I think that I think the federal government does have enough power that needs. The area where I think Congress could do more, but I think Dan's right on this point. Congress has become so paralyzed, it would be hard to see them passing a law in the next year about this, is to actually set some ground rules for the use of new technologies by law enforcement to try to get ahead of any disorder by collecting intelligence. For example, we're not very clear on the rules that apply to drones. We suppose police agency department wants to use some of the incoming money from the federal government to just buy a lot of surveillance drones. Right? The FAA still hasn't really figured out how to regulate drones. What about using AI and other kinds of electronic surveillance to try to monitor social media, to again get ahead of any coming disorder, to see who's planning what? The rules are still hazy, I think, about monitoring or even using social media. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court really hasn't decided any case that sort of lays out how the standard Fourth Amendment doctrines that we're familiar with for warrants, not unwarranted search and seizures and so on, reasonable regulatory searches and so on, searches in public, how do those all apply to the world of social media, which is where I think we've seen groups and people who are interested in causing unrest, whether it was in the attack on the Capitol or in the disorders in the cities from last summer. That's where they go to organize. That's where they go to sort of reach out to all their decentralized members. I sympathize with agencies because it's not clear how the current older doctrines apply to this new form of technology that is so important and valuable to people who might be interested in committing violence.
Well, John, you open up a number of areas for us to explore further. And you talked about earlier about the Supreme Court. And of course, there's a new majority. There's a lot of speculation about what that may mean for some of these issues that you're discussing, whether it's technology, law enforcement, civil protest. How are you envisioning the impact of the new, what is perceived as a new majority on the Supreme Court, the impact for the issues that are being faced today with respect to protest and unrest?
I think on this one, Dan and I will probably disagree about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, where the court's going, but we probably agree about how it's going to get there. And the Supreme Court has a new conservative majority. A majority of the justices now seem to believe that the Constitution should be interpreted based on the understanding of those who ratified the Constitution, not our, understandings today. This could be a radical departure for the court. I'd say this is probably the most conservative court that has existed since before the New Deal, if it does sort of follow in that methodology. So I think two things spring from that. One is conservatives like the ones from the majority who do look to original understanding, they are going to be more respectful, I think, of state prerogatives and more skeptical of claims of broader federal power than in the past. In fact, you could say that one of the great revolution, maybe unnoticed revolutions at the court of the last 30 years under Chief Justice Rehnquist and Chief Justice Roberts has been this growing support for states and their powers, particularly in areas like law enforcement, where a lot of, I think, the cases from the Warren Court period from the 60s and 70s have been narrowed significantly in favor of law enforcement. And then the second thing I would just say as a caveat is that it's not clear how that cuts on to the question of new technologies. And I'll just point to this most recent case of Carpenter, which was the case about smartphones. Whether law enforcement needed a warrant in order to ask cell phone companies to give it the location of cell phones. I think most people had thought you wouldn't need a warrant for that under the exception that had been created by the Rehnquist and Roberts courts for information that you voluntarily give to a third party. In this case, the cell phone companies themselves. Nevertheless, Chief Justice Roberts supplied the fifth vote for a majority to say, even though our old cases about pen registers and handing off things to third parties would suggest you don't need a warrant for law enforcement to find out the location of a cell phone, we think smartphones are so important to our individual lives that we are going to expand our notion of what's covered by Fourth Amendment privacy to require a warrant even for that. That just shows that a court that's really considered very conservative and may be becoming even more so. Conservative liberal, as we've understood them, may not mean the same things when it comes to how to handle new technology. One last thing about social media, the conservative view might have once been, they're private companies. They have the right to free speech. They can do whatever they want. But yet in the last few weeks, you've seen several conservative justices and judges say, maybe we got to allow stricter government regulation of social media because they become like the railroads were last century. They're the railroads of today. They're how we get around, and that's how we use information. So I don't know. I can't confidently predict that conservative liberal polarity is going to necessarily apply to these new technologies and law enforcement.
Well, thank you, John. Dan, I'd love to get your perspective on that. What direction do you see the Supreme Court going?
Well, I certainly agree about new technologies. You're just not going to get a lot of enlightenment from the debates of the 1790s about access to Facebook accounts or smartphones or any of those issues. I think even beyond that, the sort of liberal conservative dichotomy may not map very cleanly onto some of these issues. Justice Gorsuch, for example, who's very conservative on many issues, I think has also had a track record of being more sympathetic to individual rights claims in the civil procedure area, more worried about protecting individual privacy. I think we may get some interesting configurations on some of these issues. I think John is definitely right on the federalism issue, although we don't know yet how far they'll go with that. The conservative court has shown also concerns about laws that give too much discretion to the president or the executive branch, although I suspect that in the area of sort of response to disorder and public emergencies, the court may be less inclined to limit the executive than they might be in other areas. All of us in the legal academy are really looking forward, some with anticipation and some with trepidation to see how this new Supreme Court develops.
Well, thank you both for that. Very interesting, but I'd like to take everything we've been discussing about and apply it to some real life circumstances, and particularly the line between free speech and criminal activities. We've spoken a lot about some constitutional concepts here, the protests of last year, but we did get a lot of questions ahead of time from attendees asking about this question of how do you draw the line between free speech and criminal activities? And I'll relay some of the questions more specifically to you. Can you describe the differences in policing a civil protest versus a riot? What's the difference between civil unrest and uncivil unrest? And referencing the January 6th events. Dan, would you kick us off on this conversation of the line between First Amendment activities, criminal activities, and how to draw that line, and frankly, how you think the courts will interpret it going forward?
I think it's clear that the government has some power to regulate First Amendment activities in terms of their time, place, and manner. And in the past, that's typically come up in settings like national political conventions and the question of how much the police can do to sort of separate the protesters from the event, what kinds of restrictions they can apply. I think clearly the government has a right to try to keep public order through reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner. I think in many cases, what we have been seeing may at least, even if peaceful, violate various kinds of misdemeanor laws, obstructing traffic, conducting a public meeting or a parade without a permit, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me that as a practical matter, even though legally it might have some significance, it doesn't really change the calculus very much. If you've got tens of thousands of people on the street, the idea that you're going to ticket all of them for obstructing traffic just really isn't in the cards anyway. So I think a really kind of overriding principle is proportionality, that even if there is some behavior that's technically illegal, the response to that has to be proportionate. The real problem is, I think, deciding at what point you've moved beyond any kind of technical infractions, and you've moved into the area of serious political misconduct. But I think it's quite clear that things like smashing store windows and setting things on fire and so forth, that's not constitutionally protected speech. And so the problem you have in dealing with things like that is not a constitutional problem. It's a practical problem of how do you go about getting that under control.
John, your perspective on all this?
Yeah, I think I agree with Dan on the law and the policy. Maybe looking back at what happened last summer, I would do things differently in how police departments in some places approached the disorder. So I think Dan's quite right. The Constitution allows the government to regulate the time, place, and manner of speech in a reasonable way. And so, for example, you need to get a permit to have a parade that closes down a number of streets. I think in terms of policy, I would say, however, the better thing to do, and here I agree with Dan, the better thing to do might be to let spontaneous protests of a nonviolent nature to proceed anyway, because I think the risks of sort of escalating violence by trying to contain a primarily peaceful free speech exercise could escalate, could be greater. On the other hand, I think what I saw in several of our cities, not all of them certainly, but some of our cities, were that police were then, I think, too lax when it came to stopping violence and stopping property crime. I think maybe some mayors and maybe some police leadership maybe started out with the idea, let free speech protests go ahead. And then when they escalated into violence, when escalated into attacks on property, police continued sort of hands-off attitude. And there, I think that's where the law does allow police to intervene to stop the commission of crimes, certainly felonies, also to intervene to stop violence, to prevent harm to not just themselves, but to third parties. And so I think that the law allows that. And I think police departments, I saw some over the summers, not fully relying on that legal authority. And I think the problem is that then allowed some serious disorder to occur in places like here in Oakland and San Francisco, or in New York City. For example, I'm sure we all saw the videos from both cities. So I think maybe relying more on the legal authority to protect property, to stop crime, and to protect violence, physical violence against individuals, I think could be maybe better promoted or relied on if there are, I hope not, but if there are a series of disorders again, say, for example, because of COVID lockdowns or because of the verdict in the Chauvin trial.
So, John, we've talked so far today about the federal authorities, the different branches of government, and now applying it more on the state and local level. In light of everything that happened last year, for state and local authorities, what should they be thinking about moving forward? How do we take the lessons of the last year, apply it forward? What actions would you be recommending to executives on the state and local level after last year?
That's all you want to know? That's a tough question. So just the way to frame it, think about it, take a step back and think about it, is I really sympathize with a lot of the people who are listening, because as executives in charge of this issue, you will have to decide the policies to apply right away And a lot of the institutions that Eileen just mentioned and that Dan and I have been talking about, the federal government, the courts, Congress, maybe even the federal executive branch, they're not going to come into it immediately. And you might be worried they're going to be second guessing you, especially the courts, which may not review what you do for 2 or 3 years in a much more comfortable time without the pressure of circumstances and emergency. And they might say, we think you were wrong. I worry sometimes that kind of, worry about people looking over your shoulders years into the future is a problem. On the other hand, I would say, I would stress that the courts have said repeatedly, we're not here to second guess you. We're not armchair quarterbacks. Our job is to say, did you do the reasonable thing under the circumstances at that time? The courts try to put themselves in the place of the officers and on the circumstances as they understood them, even if it turned out to be wrong, but they made a reasonable judgment. And so how would you do that? So I think if I were to extrapolate from the courts and decisions, one way to do that is to try to look at sort of standardized practice. I mean, if you're following the Chauvin trial right now, of course, you're seeing a lot of cross-examination exams about what's taught, what is the policy, right? What do other departments do? And so I think to the extent that a police agency say, we're not just making up our approach to how we're going to handle civil disorder, but we have studied what other departments have done, what's worked and not worked in the past, and we've shared information amongst departments through calls like this, in fact, and through centers like the one that's sponsoring this call. To the extent we can share and standardize our approach, not to say we have to apply the same rule in every city and town, but we start out with the same basic ideas, same basics, and then we modify them for our local. I think that provides a very powerful defense to claims 2-3 years later that you did the wrong thing. And I think second, and this goes to some of the earlier questions, I think where the courts will be particularly deferential would be, again, trying to use these new technologies, saying, look, we don't know what the rules are. The courts and Congress haven't passed any rules. So maybe we're going to start looking at Facebook more aggressively to try to figure out if there are conspiracies that are being pulled together to commit violence. I wish the government had done that, in January about the attack on the Capitol. I think that in the end, the courts will be a little more generous to police agencies, police departments, public safety departments that try to use drones, that try to use CCTV, that try to use investigation using social media as a way to detect any looming threat earlier. And then, for example, surge police officers to certain locations ahead of time. Because I think it's fair to say it's a reasonable thing to do. And you can't say that the courts have told you not to do it yet, because the courts are so far behind what's going on the ground.
And your perspective on the best advice to give state and local authorities as they're reflecting on the last year.
So I think we're starting to learn from the after action reports and investigations. Some of that is going to have lessons broadly nationally. Some of it may point up specific problems that are unique to certain jurisdictions. I think John is right that clearly a lot of what's important is what takes place before the disorder erupts, both in terms of trying to have as much intelligence as possible, trying to think through in advance on what kinds of policies to apply, even if in the heat of the event you may have to make modifications, thinking about who should be at the table. What kinds of, is this just a problem for the police? Do you need other people providing insight so you can show that you have, not only so you can show that you have, but so in fact you can have a process that is trying to integrate whatever perspectives are important. Making sure that lines of communications are clear in advance. And that people actually know who they need to talk to and how to contact. This stuff isn't rocket science, but it's, I know I do more work in the area of sort of natural disasters, and it's the sort of thing that can go by the wayside until things actually go bad, and then it's too late. So it's important to build that kind of sort of institutional and process infrastructure. I guess this is infrastructure week. Beforehand, rather than trying desperately when things go bad to figure out how you're going to approach them.
Dan, there was a question that came in advance that I think is designed specifically for you. One writer indicated, at least from their perspective, that in California, the leadership seem much less inclined to insert themselves into the political judgments the judgments of public safety officials, and that they kept politics out of it, at least from their perspective. And so the question was, assuming this observation is true, what legislative actions can be done to elevate the authorities of emergency management professionals during a crisis that demands a certain type of action necessary to effectively address the unrest? And I assume the subtext is not make those decisions as political as perhaps some may perceive them to be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's very tricky. So I think you could, you could see state laws, for example, shifting more authority in the direction of the police chief or, sheriff or whoever the appropriate person would be, or in maybe more realistically into an incident management team. I do think that we should be careful about excluding political actors entirely, partly because these are big policy decisions that, where there should be some democratic input. They're not just questions of tactics, but also because one of the things that we need to worry about in handling civil unrest is not just dealing with the incident, but dealing with the sort of long-term repercussions of the incident and the response. So we could successfully suppress disorder, but it could be done in a way that will, make the situation in the community worse in the long run. And that's something I think you can expect maybe the political people to be more attuned to than law enforcement who are naturally focused purely on the short-term response. So as with many things, I think it is kind of a difficult balancing act.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Dawn tells me we have a number of terrific questions pending, so I'm going to ask Dawn to queue up some of those questions for us.
Thanks, Eileen. Actually, the first question that's up on deck is for you, and drawing upon your experience as a public safety professional and now with the Police Commission in Los Angeles. How does public trust factor into these discussions of local, state, and federal powers and laws? What does that mean in a federalism conversation?
Well, it's significantly, it's embedded in everything that we've talked about, and public trust is key to being public servants, right? The authorities that John and Dan spoke about earlier come from the public, and those authorities exist as long as the public has faith and trust in their own systems. Building public trust, is a constant effort that has to be undertaken by every level of government. I think in the last year, maybe longer, if we reflect back, every institution is being challenged, and public trust has gone down, whether it's in government, corporations, media, universities. We live in an era where people are challenging institutions and whether they're deserving of trust. So particularly in the area of policing, it's a never-ending journey to constantly earn that public trust. And it is very hard to get, and I'm going to throw this question back on John and Dan and flip it more into a federalism question, because I think when I listen to law enforcement officers as they talk about trust, accountability, transparency, all those important things that they're doing every day. They note how easily those efforts are undermined when something may happen 2,000 miles away that they are held accountable for. And my question to you that I'd like to flip back to you is, at some point in this national dialogue, should not the federal government be stepping in and creating perhaps national standards that we all agree to? When something that's happening in Minnesota is impacting cities 2,000 miles away, isn't there a greater national interest, a federal interest to be taken here to ensure that this issue that Trust brings up, that Don brings up, can be sustained and not broken so easily? John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've got an idea, but it could be a typical crazy Berkeley professor idea that should never be put into practice. But
You're not a typical Berkeley professor, so
I'm not a typical.
Maybe not.
Dan is. I mean, check him out with the black turtleneck and everything. I mean, fits right. So some of it comes from my experience after 9/11 working in the government. So, one thing that came to my mind as Dan was talking and Eileen, you were talking, was, of course, one way to do this is to run what we used to call tabletop exercises. If we think there's disorder that could arise after the Chauvin trial or this summer, one way to identify the vulnerable points in the decision-making process and carrying them out would be to run a simulation, run several simulations, figure out who the right person is in the organization to sort of, concentrate decisions to. But the one thing we didn't do, and I look back at that, and it goes to your point, Eileen, is that we did not include community groups in that. Because in the federal government, we're always worried about, we don't want people on the outside to know, right? Intelligence. We don't want people to know the policies we're thinking about. And so we, usually excluded anyone who was not a Justice Department or FBI official. I would say for state and so one thing is I could see including them more, following up on his point, both at the state and federal level. So for example, if there's a verdict in the Chauvin trial that people are very upset about, and not just in Minneapolis, but all the major cities, well, then I think local community leaders can be very helpful in explaining and working with elected officials and the police chiefs to explain why violence is not the answer, or even to help identify these are where we think the trouble spots are going to be. These are the people to watch out for, not because they're trying to get anybody arrested, but just because they don't want to see more destruction and death in their cities. I mean, these leaders of churches, hospital leaders, right, university and school leaders, they don't want disorder to harm people either. I also think that's something we could do at the federal level, which I don't remember us doing last summer, which is also bring forward the kinds of people Eileen's talking about who could speak about our national standards of justice, our national views of ethics and morality, but they're not employees of the federal government, right? They are church leaders, university leaders, so people who are important in the community and the life of the community, and might actually help build this public trust Eileen's talking about in reducing violence and disorder, because people will trust them independent because of their independent status from the government. They're not working for the government. And so what they're saying will give added credibility, I think, to a message that violence and rioting is not the answer to whatever might happen this summer in terms of jury verdicts or in terms of people, living under COVID restrictions they don't like anymore.
Dan, do you want to add your perspective before I ask Don for the next question?
Well, actually, I think unlike a number of John's crazy ideas, I think that one makes a lot of sense. I think
let's put that on the record. There's always a first time.
No, I think involving the community can be helpful in a number of ways, including what John discussed, but also in getting a better sense of what kinds of responses would be more likely to provoke a backlash from the community than others. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is if you're a peaceful protester, whatever the cause is, the people who run around the edges of the protest and break windows and resort to violence and so forth, that's really detrimental to the message you're trying to get across. And I've seen that in Oakland and in Berkeley on campus, right? It's hard to have a peaceful demonstration if you've got all these other people who may not even be motivated by your cause, but are taking advantage of it. And so just the fact that people in the community are mad, and they're maybe even mad at the police, doesn't mean that they're on the side of the criminals who are taking advantage of the opportunity. And that's something that maybe involving community leaders might allow you to tap into. So rebuilding trust is hard. I mean, there has been this, I think, disastrous loss of trust in almost all institutions in our society. And this is not something you can fix easily, or that any one, institution is going to be able to fix on its own. But I do think maintaining transparency and accountability, dialogue, I think there's evidence, even in the public health area, that if you want people to get vaccinated and people are worried about it, the most effective speakers are likely to be those who are known and respected in the community, not necessarily big names from Washington, even big names that are popular in the community, that they may not have the same kind of credibility.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Dawn, do you want to give us the next question, please?
Yes, Eileen, the next question harkens back to some earlier comments by the panel about whether there is ever a role for federal law enforcement authorities when events happen at the state and local level. So do any of the panelists think that federal law enforcement has any ability to intervene if they think local and state leaders are not stopping or interceding in criminal activity, or is law enforcement inherently and universally a local item?
Dan, do you want to take that first?
So first of all, clearly when there are interstate aspects to what's going on, something John mentioned earlier, but when you have groups operating across state lines in a way that local government can't really deal with effectively, that's one. Second, I think in extreme situations, we have something called the Insurrection Act that would allow the federal government, not necessarily through law, probably just as much through federalizing the National Guard or other steps to intervene. That's really, I think, a last resort, but it is, potentially there if you have a situation where really the ability of government to function effectively at the state and local level is really in peril.
John, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to add a little bit to Dan's mention of the Insurrection Act, is there's something also called the Posse Comitatus Act, which is seen as a general restriction on the use of the military for law enforcement purposes. And this has mostly occurred, I think, in the drug interdiction context. It's been understood or interpreted by the federal government not to prevent the federal government providing support as long as they're not sort of the federal officials are not the ones doing the arrests. So even to the point where I believe the federal government's allowed to, provide the ship that interdicts the drug cartel runner, but then it's somebody else who actually makes the DA agent, for example, who makes the actual arrest under civilian laws. So if you put that in the context of this, what happens if certain kinds of disruptions are so large and violent that they, start to overwhelm the local authorities? Federal government can do a lot of the behind the scenes work to take the pressure off personnel and resources, like transportation, like communication networks, like intelligence, both gathering and sharing, so that state and local can surge more of their personnel to the actual front lines where state and local will do the direct interaction with citizens. So, but again, to do that effectively requires a lot of coordination because it might involve handing off, sort of being in charge of running communication networks during a serious disorder from state to federal, which of course is going to be very difficult.
Eileen, in that same vein, we've gotten several questions here about the role of the National Guard deployments, either at the local, state, federal level. Any changes in 2020 on what you and the panel see happening in use of National Guard in law enforcement settings?
Sure. John, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I think the National Guard issue follows naturally from Dan's discussion of the Insurrection Act. To have the National Guard involved at the federalized level, you would need to have something like the Insurrection Act involved, or the sort of this role I was discussing as a sort of a backup or support role. That doesn't mean, of course, though, the National Guard is also today's version, traces its origins back to the 18th century militia, state militias. And so whether the president decides to federalize or not the National Guard and the Insurrection Act, state governors have, I think, much broader discretion in calling forth the state units and how to use them. I mean, we kind of see in Dan's area of natural disaster relief is probably how most Americans have seen the National Guard on TV. And a lot of those situations are acting in the state capacity, not the federal capacity. So again, I think that this is an issue where I think we can learn from the past. I think many people think the response to Hurricane Katrina was not a good example of how to use the National Guard because there was so much dispute and confusion between the federal and state authorities. I would point again maybe to the Rodney King riots here in Los Angeles. I think is commonly thought of as having been a fairly good example, although there was a lot of violence and death and destruction. We didn't suffer from unclarity. We didn't suffer from confusion. I believe the Wilson administration and the National Guard units were you're very well coordinated here. And I think a lot of that was because, and this goes to one of Dan's last points, the involvement of political officials, I think, make that possible. So, there's a certain thing a level you can reach with coordination, with simulations and tabletop exercises. But I think to really make that National Guard and the federal state relationship run as smoothly as possible, you have to have the governor or a senator, the leading of the U.S. attorneys, as Eileen was, or the special agent in charge, and make sure that they have talked and know what to say to each other to get the authorities triggered correctly early, rather than, as we saw in Katrina, sort of fumbling around for several days, figuring out who's in charge of what.
And also, I would add for community support of the decision to bring in the National Guard, because some members of the community may look at it as the over militarization of a municipality, and having political leadership in that context is always important. Dan, you literally wrote the book on this, so I want to be sure you have a chance to join into the conversation on the National Guard.
Yeah, I think the use of the National Guard is almost always going to be initiated by the governor, even in situations where the federal government might be able to override the governor. There's a lot of reluctance to do that. I think it's a very tricky decision in the situations we're talking about, whether to bring in the Guard, because you don't want to over militarize. But on the other hand, at some point, you may not have another really effective way of responding. One of the sort of shortcomings of bringing in the Guard or the military in any guise is they're not really trained in law enforcement. So there's certainly ways in which, to the extent law enforcement can handle the situation, that's a much better fit between skills and training and experience than having the Guard in. But it's one of the situations where no matter what you do, you might be criticized either for bringing the Guard in when when it's an overreaction, or as in the case of the Capitol riot, for failing to act promptly enough in bringing the Guard in. I think the one thing you can almost be sure of is it's very unlikely you're going to emerge from this kind of situation without somebody being mad at you and thinking you did the wrong thing. It's just the nature of these really difficult situations.
Of course, and it's always easy to pick apart in hindsight. Absolutely. Dawn, I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks, Eileen. Series of questions here, actually, for anyone on the panel who'd like to field them, about misinformation and disinformation efforts that could lead up to legal protest or illegal activity. Do any one of our panelists have thoughts on what we might see about the criminalization or specific statutes targeting purposeful disinformation campaigns to either ignite the fire of legal or illegal activities, or to more specifically criminalize what that might do to hamper law enforcement's response?
Dan, do you want to go first on this one?
In terms of criminal law, I'm not familiar, at least at this point, with efforts along that direction. I could certainly imagine doing so. There could be some real constitutional issues that would have to be thought through carefully. If one problem with criminalizing false information is that it can make people reluctant to speak at all for fear that somewhere, that they'll slip up, make a mistake, and all of a sudden it's a crime. I think this does, however, bring to my mind another aspect of these civil disorders that I'm not sure we're used to thinking about, which is thinking about how social media companies should respond in these urgent situations. What policies do they have? Should they have? Are they people who should be in touch with local law enforcement on some level? I think that's a whole set of problems that I suspect we're only beginning to think about.
John, do you want to add your perspective, particularly what you said earlier about social media companies?
Yeah, I think, so one, Dan is quite right, of course, that the First Amendment would create serious problems if the government was to say, all things which are not totally true about, this event are banned. I mean, I think that would be a violation of the First Amendment. On the other hand, speech that is part of committing a crime is not protected speech. So for maybe the line could be drawn here, right? If you're commenting, say you don't like the outcome of the Chauvin verdict that's coming. Suppose you think maybe he's convicted, but you think he should be, put away for life and the prosecution messed up. You can really say that. I think that's, and you might even say, I think everyone who's angry about that should show up in town and protest. I think that's protected. I think speech that goes to the point of bring, this kind of weapon at this street corner and do this, that's not protected, it seems to me. That's a conspiracy to commit a crime. And I think that could be, but how does a police agency, police department, or even the federal government stop people from communicating in that way? I think technically that's going to be very difficult because, as Dan mentioned, that's going to be really in the hands of the private businesses, Facebook, Google, YouTube. They're the ones who actually control the transmission of this information. So it seems to me the answer, if this is the way the question was going, is not really going to be in trying to stop that kind of speech. The better answer seems to me is try to monitor that and then use the information to try to get public safety personnel and police at those locations where they think these conspiracies are going to occur.
Well, thank you both for that. We're going to close out right now. If I could ask John and Dan, each of you to, give us your closing comments on this topic and what we've covered today. Dan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I don't know that I have any great words of wisdom for the people who are facing these problems. It is clear that a lot of the onus is going to lie on state and local, and especially local law enforcement and local officials. And I don't think that the decisions are going to be easy ones. I don't think there's any way of making them easy decisions. What I think we have learned is the need to be prepared in advance, to think clearly through who's going to do what. It's clear that training is important. We've been thinking mostly in terms of the decisions that the sort of top level people are making, but the people the law enforcement out there on the streets are also going to have to be making decisions on the spot. And that's another area where whatever can be done in advance in the way of training or guidelines or whatever is all to the good, rather than expecting people to go out and just sort of improvise, in the heat of the moment. Again, I think the big lesson is half of the important part of the response happens before the event.
Thank you, Dan. John?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Dan has said, that this is, this put the onus on many of the people that stay in local level because of federalism. Maybe one way to also understand this point of preparation is that honestly seems to me a lot of the criminal justice system is aimed at a retrospective way to handle problems. Crime occurs, and then we send in the police. We have courts and prosecutors who reconstruct what happened historically. A lot of what we're talking about now is preventive in a way. It's like preventive medicine, right? You want to take the early steps now to prevent something from becoming much worse later. Generally, our criminal justice system is not well suited for that because you can make mistakes, right? You can over prevent. And so we've been comfortable in the criminal justice system primarily not to try to prevent crimes before they occur. We can do some of that, but we don't try to be predictive as much. On the other hand, a lot of the reductions in crime in a lot of our major cities, I think, were due to using predictive algorithms, using predictive policing based on past data. Maybe that's the way a lot of things we're talking about are moving us even further towards when it comes to civil unrest, is trying to use technology, information, and information sharing to have better predictive judgments about what's going to happen. And given that the violence and destruction could be so great based on what we saw last summer, I think maybe the courts and our political leadership will be a little more sympathetic to taking a more preventive approach than they have been in the past.
Thank you, John. Thank you both, Dan and John, for your time today. Your insights have been invaluable. Today, we've tried to highlight the frameworks for decision-making, hopefully the context for past decisions, and more importantly, the context for future decision-making that will be made with respect to the issues surrounding unrest in our communities. We'd like to thank you for joining us today and very much appreciate your time. Dawn, back to you.
Thank you to our panel, and Eileen, thank you again for moderating today's conversation. On behalf of the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security and our co-hosts at ASTO, IAM, NEMA, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association Foundation, thank you to our audience for joining us today.